Hello and welcome to the Whispering Worlds channel. What would you do if the life you built was suddenly shattered by betrayal? In this emotional and suspenseful tale, you're invited to walk alongside Michael as he navigates the wreckage of his marriage and the painful truth about the woman he once loved, with twists of intrigue, unexpected revelations, and the promise of redemption. This story challenges you to reflect on loyalty, resilience, and the strength to rebuild after the devastation. Your voice matters. Share your thoughts, predictions, and insights as Michael's journey unfolds. How would you confront betrayal? What choices would you make in the face of heartbreak? Join the conversation and become part of this compelling narrative of love lost, trust broken, and the search for hope. The sun peeked over the horizon, casting warm golden hues on the quiet suburban street. It was a morning like any other in our household. Routine had long since become a second language for Sarah and me. 10 years of marriage did that to you. Each day folded into the next with comforting predictability. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard as I backed out of the driveway, the familiar creak of our garage door echoing behind me. It was 8:15 a.m., and I was right on schedule. Sarah had kissed me goodbye with her usual warm smile, still wrapped in her robe as she sipped her coffee. "Don't forget dinner with the Johnsons tomorrow," she'd reminded me, as she often did with our shared calendar items. "Of course not," I had replied, chuckling as I pulled away. The drive to work was typically uneventful, a 15-minute stretch of main roads and highways. I usually tuned into a morning talk show or an audiobook, but this morning, something gnawed at the back of my mind. Halfway down Route 17, I suddenly remembered my presentation. The neatly organized binder with my notes and materials wasn't sitting in the passenger seat where it should have been. I groaned and pulled over into the nearest gas station parking lot, mentally retracing my steps. I'd left it on the dining table. I knew it without question. With a sigh, I turned the car around and headed back home. Time was tight, but I could still make it. The only saving grace was that Sarah's mornings were usually filled with errands. She'd probably already left the house. When I pulled back into the driveway, everything seemed as normal as ever. Our black SUV sat in its usual spot, and the curtains in the living room were drawn halfway. I fumbled with my keys at the door, stepping inside with the intention of grabbing the binder and leaving immediately. The silence of the house struck me first. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock were the only sounds. But as I crossed the threshold, something else caught my ear. Low murmurs, laughter, from the bedroom. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. For a moment, I told myself it was nothing. Perhaps Sarah was watching TV in bed, or maybe she was on the phone with a friend. But the laughter was joined by another voice. A man's voice. Each step toward the bedroom felt heavier than the last. My pulse quickened, and my palms grew clammy as I pushed the door open. And there she was, Sarah, my wife of 10 years, tangled in the sheets with our neighbor, Alan. I don't know how long I stood there. A second? A minute? My chest tightened as a wave of emotions crashed over me. Shock, disbelief, anger, and something deeper, something more paralyzing. Neither of them noticed me at first, too engrossed in their entangled state. I saw the faint glint of sunlight on her wedding ring, still on her hand as if it had any meaning left. The creak of the floorboard under my weight betrayed my presence. Alan froze, his face twisting into a grimace. Sarah turned her head, her expression shifting from surprise to sheer panic in an instant. "Michael," she started, her voice barely a whisper. But I didn't stay to hear what came next. My feet moved on their own, carrying me out of the room, down the stairs and back into the car. I slammed the door shut, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just drove. At work, my colleagues greeted me with their usual pleasantries, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I plastered on a fake smile and went through the motions of my day. When the time came to give my presentation, I delivered it flawlessly, earning nods of approval and polite applause. But inside, I was anything but calm. When I returned home that evening, Sarah greeted me at the door, her smile as warm as it had been that morning. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, her voice sweet and casual as though nothing had happened. I studied her for a moment, noting the ease with which she lied. My throat tightened, but I forced a smile. "Same as usual," I replied, stepping past her. She didn't suspect a thing. For the rest of the evening, I played my role perfectly. We ate dinner together, discussing mundane topics like the weather and weekend plans. But inside, I was unraveling, and I knew that everything I thought I knew about my life had been a lie. And so began the longest week of my life. The following morning, I woke to the familiar chime of my alarm clock. The glow of dawn filtered through the blinds, casting long slivers of light across the room. Sarah stirred beside me, her breathing steady, her face serene. She looked exactly as she had every morning for the last decade. Yet something had fundamentally changed. The memory of yesterday was a weight in my chest, heavy and unrelenting. I wanted to say something, confront her, demand answers. But as she opened her eyes and smiled, her lips forming the soft "good morning" I'd heard countless times, I swallowed the words. "Good morning," I mumbled back, my voice thick with forced normalcy. I showered, dressed, and left the house as usual, but every action felt like I was operating on autopilot. My mind was elsewhere, on Sarah, on Alan, on the sounds I'd heard and the images I couldn't unsee. At work, my colleagues noticed something was off. Late night, Mark, my cubicle neighbor, joked as he passed by with his coffee. "Something like that," I replied, forcing a chuckle. The truth was, I hadn't slept much. The vivid replay of Sarah's betrayal kept me tossing and turning, and when I did drift off, it was only to be jolted awake by the memory of her voice, her laughter, and the sight of someone else in what was supposed to be our sacred space. At lunch, I scrolled through my phone aimlessly, wondering if Sarah had texted me. She hadn't. It was business as usual, just as it had been every day before I'd turned the car around. That evening, I returned home to find Sarah cooking in the kitchen, humming to herself as though the world was perfectly intact. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, the scent of garlic and rosemary wafting through the air. "How was work?" she asked, her tone light and casual. "Fine," I replied, my voice clipped. I watched her move about the kitchen, every gesture so normal, so practiced. The way she chopped vegetables, the way she stirred the sauce. It was all a performance, but now I couldn't unsee it for what it truly was. Over dinner, I tried to engage her in conversation, probing gently for any cracks in her facade. "Did you see anyone today?" I asked, my voice as steady as I could manage. Sarah didn't flinch. "Oh, just the usual. Ran into Katie at the store. We chatted for a bit." "And Alan?" I asked, forcing myself to meet her gaze. Her hand paused for a fraction of a second as she reached for her glass of wine, but she recovered quickly. "No, why do you ask?" "Just wondering," I said, shrugging. Her smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. That night, as she lay asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The doubt, the questions, the anger. It was all consuming me, and yet I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not yet. The next day followed the same pattern. I left for work, drove halfway, and then, unable to resist, turned the car around. This time, I parked a block away and approached the house on foot, moving as quietly as I could. I peered through the window, the curtains slightly parted. The sight that met my eyes made my stomach churn. Sarah wasn't alone. This time it was another man, Jim, the neighbor from 2 doors down. The easy camaraderie they shared, the way she leaned into him, the laughter that spilled from her lips. It was all too familiar. I couldn't watch any longer. I retreated to my car, my mind reeling. The betrayal wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a pattern, a lifestyle. That evening, I returned home, my face a mask of calm as I stepped through the door. "Hey, hon," Sarah greeted me, her voice warm and inviting. "How was your day?" "Good," I replied, forcing a smile. "Yours?" "Uneventful," she said, her tone light. I nodded, swallowing the bitter taste in my mouth. For the next few days, I repeated the routine. Each time I found Sarah with a different man, and each time I walked away before they noticed me. I began to notice patterns. The way she would glance at the clock when she thought she was alone. The way she ensured the curtains were never fully drawn. At night, lying beside her, I wrestled with my emotions. Anger and sadness mixed with a strange numbness. My wife, the woman I had loved and trusted for a decade, was living a double life. The question wasn't if I would confront her. It was when. The morning light felt harsher as it seeped through the blinds. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the hardwood floor, my mind miles away. Behind me, I could hear Sarah moving about, humming a soft tune as she prepared for her day. Her voice, once a source of comfort, now felt like nails against a chalkboard. "Do you want pancakes or eggs?" she called from the kitchen, her tone impossibly cheerful. "Not hungry," I replied, my voice devoid of energy. She poked her head around the corner, her face etched with concern. "You've been so distant lately, Michael. Is everything okay?" The sheer audacity of her question hit me like a slap. My lips twitched with the effort to hold back the flood of words threatening to escape. Instead, I nodded. "Just work stuff," I lied. Her expression softened, and she approached, wrapping her arms around my shoulders. Her touch made my skin crawl, but I didn't flinch. "Not yet. You know you can talk to me about anything," she said softly. I wanted to laugh at the irony, but the sound lodged in my throat. "I know," I managed, before gently extricating myself from her embrace. As I left the house, I felt her eyes on me, but I didn't look back. At work, I couldn't focus. My mind was consumed by the growing list of questions. Why? How long had this been going on? Was it something I'd done, or hadn't done? During lunch, Mark stopped by my desk again. "Seriously, man, you've been out of it all week. Want to grab a beer after work and talk about it?" I considered it for a moment. Mark was a good guy, the kind who listened without judgment. But the weight of my secret was too personal, too raw. "Maybe another time," I said. He nodded, offering a pat on the shoulder before walking away. By the time I returned home, I had resolved to find answers. Not by confronting Sarah, at least not yet, but by piecing together the truth myself. That evening, while Sarah was in the shower, I began my search. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter, a device I had never felt the need to question. Now, it was a gateway to understanding the person she had become. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the screen. Was this an invasion of privacy? Did I even care? The phone was locked, of course, but I knew the passcode. Birthdays were hard to forget. The first thing I noticed was a flurry of messages. Some were innocent exchanges with her friends, but others, "Alan, yesterday was incredible. Can't wait for next time. Jim, still thinking about you. Same time tomorrow." My chest tightened as I scrolled through the threads. It wasn't just the neighbors. It was a tangled web of connections I couldn't begin to comprehend. Some messages were playful, others explicit, all of them a stark betrayal. I snapped the phone shut as I heard the water stop running. My hands trembled, and my breathing came in shallow gasps. Dinner that night was a charade, as it had been every night that week. Sarah prattled on about her day, chores, a run-in with Katie, and plans for the weekend. "What about you?" she asked, her eyes wide and innocent. "Same old," I replied, managing a tight smile. As I watched her, I realized something unsettling. She wasn't just lying. She was comfortable with it. Every word, every gesture was so natural, so practiced. Later that night, as Sarah slept beside me, I began to form a plan. If I was going to confront her, I needed more than anger. I needed clarity, evidence. The next day, I left for work as usual but returned an hour later, this time with a purpose. I parked down the street and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Sure enough, it wasn't long before a car pulled into the driveway. This time it was Tom, the man who lived across the street. I watched as he entered the house, the door closing behind him. I waited, my stomach churning with a mix of dread and resolve. When Tom finally left, his expression casual, I knew I couldn't wait much longer. That evening, I confronted Sarah indirectly. Ran into Tom today, I said casually over dinner. Nice guy. Always seems to be busy. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't even look up from her plate. Yeah, he's always working on something. Her nonchalance was both infuriating and revealing. Do you ever talk to him? I pressed. She shrugged. Not really. Why? I didn't answer. Couldn't. That night I couldn't sleep. My plan was nearly complete, but a part of me still hesitated. This was my wife, the woman I had shared my life with for over a decade. The woman I had once believed was my partner, my confidant, my everything. But as I lay in the darkness, the images of her betrayals played in my mind like a broken reel. I knew what I had to do. Tomorrow everything would change. The morning dawned with a sense of foreboding. For the first time in days, Sarah's usual morning hum was absent. The silence between us over breakfast was deafening, punctuated only by the occasional clink of a spoon against a cereal bowl. She must have noticed the change in me. Are you sure everything's okay? She asked, her brows knitting together as she placed her coffee mug down. I nodded, unable to muster a verbal response. Inside, I was a maelstrom of emotions. I had spent the night refining my plan, cycling through scenarios in my mind. Should I explode in anger, lay out the evidence and demand an explanation? Or should I simply walk away? I settled on something in between. Today would be the day, but I wasn't going to rush it. Once again, I left for work but didn't make it far. I parked a few blocks away and waited. This time, I didn't bother trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. My suspicions had grown roots too deep to ignore. At 10:15 a.m., like clockwork, a sleek silver car pulled into the driveway. It wasn't Alan or Jim or even Tom. It was someone new, a man I didn't recognize. I watched as Sarah greeted him at the door, her smile radiant, her body language open and inviting. They disappeared inside, and I sat there, my grip on the steering wheel tightening. This was it. I stepped out of the car, my heart hammering in my chest as I approached the house. Every step felt heavy, as though the ground beneath me were trying to pull me back. But I couldn't stop now. The front door was unlocked. That small detail enraged me further. A symbol of her carelessness, her utter disregard for the sanctity of our home. I walked inside, my footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The sounds from upstairs were unmistakable. Laughter, muffled voices. I took a deep breath and climbed the stairs, each creak of the wood like a drumbeat, signaling the end of something I had once held sacred. When I reached the bedroom door, I paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Part of me wanted to turn around, to leave, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But the larger part of me, the part that was tired of the lies, the deceit, pushed forward. I opened the door. The room fell silent. Sarah froze, her eyes wide with shock. The man beside her sat up abruptly, his face pale as he scrambled to cover himself. Michael, Sarah began, her voice trembling. I held up a hand, cutting her off. Don't. For a moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second stretching into an eternity. You didn't even bother to lock the door, I said finally, my voice cold and steady. Sarah's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I turned my gaze to the man. Get out. He didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing his clothes, he bolted past me without so much as a word. When he was gone, I closed the door and turned back to Sarah. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. Michael, I can explain. How long? I repeated, louder this time. A few months, she admitted, her voice shaking. I laughed bitterly. A few months? Is that all? What about Alan? Jim? Tom? Are they just a few months too? Her head snapped up, her expression shifting from guilt to shock. You knew. I've known all week, I said, crossing my arms. Every single day, Sarah. Every single time. Do you have any idea what that's done to me? Tears spilled down her cheeks, but I felt no sympathy. Michael, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to. Don't. I interrupted, my voice hard. Don't you dare say you didn't mean for it to happen. You knew exactly what you were doing. Over and over again. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. But her tears didn't move me. They didn't erase the image of her with those men, the lies, the betrayal. I loved you, I said, my voice cracking. For 10 years, Sarah. I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me. She looked up, her face streaked with tears. I don't know why I did it, she said. I felt trapped. Stuck. Like we'd lost something. And I was trying to find it again. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Had we lost something? Had I been blind to the cracks in our marriage? But then I thought of the lies, the deceit, the audacity of her actions. No matter what we'd lost, this wasn't the way to fix it. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I'm filing for divorce. Sarah's sobs grew louder, but I didn't stay to listen. I left the room, grabbing my keys and walking out of the house. As I drove away, a strange sense of relief washed over me. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The days following the confrontation felt like a blur. My emotions were a storm. Anger, sadness, relief, even guilt. It was as if my entire identity, built over 10 years of marriage, had been ripped apart, leaving me with nothing but fragments to sort through. I stayed at a cheap motel on the edge of town for the first few nights. The walls were thin, the bed stiff, and the air smelled faintly of mildew, but it was quiet. That was all I needed, space to think, to process. Sarah called me several times, but I didn't answer. Her messages ranged from tearful apologies to desperate pleas for a conversation. I deleted them all without listening. I wasn't ready to face her yet, not after what I'd seen. Not after the weight of her betrayal. At work, Mark noticed my demeanor had shifted even more. You look like you've been through hell, he said, sliding into the seat across from me in the break room. Whatever it is, you don't have to go through it alone, you know? I appreciated his concern, but I wasn't ready to talk about it. Thanks, Mark, I said, forcing a smile. Just need some time to figure things out. He nodded, his eyes scanning my face for any cracks in my resolve. Take it easy, okay? Don't let it eat you alive. That evening, I decided to visit my parents. They lived about an hour away, in the house where I'd grown up. As I drove, memories of my childhood filled the silence. The simpler days when life seemed clear, when trust wasn't something I had to question. My mother opened the door, her expression shifting from surprise to concern as she took in my disheveled appearance. Michael? What's wrong? I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The warmth of the house, the familiar smell of my mother's cooking, wrapped around me like a comforting embrace. I need to talk, I said finally. Over dinner, I told them everything. The words came slowly at first, but once I started, they poured out in a flood. My father sat quietly, his brow furrowed, while my mother's face mirrored a mix of anger and sadness. That woman, she muttered, shaking her head. How could she do this to you? I don't know, I admitted, my voice hollow. I thought we were happy. I thought we had something real. My father spoke up then, his tone measured but firm. You can't blame yourself for her actions, son. She made her choices, and those choices have consequences. His words resonated, but they didn't make the pain any easier to bear. The next morning, I returned to the house. Sarah had called again, leaving another voicemail, but this time, I decided to listen. Michael, please. Her voice cracked with emotion. I know I've hurt you, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need to explain. I need you to understand why I did what I did. Please, just give me one chance to talk. I deleted the message and stepped inside. The house was quiet, eerily so. Sarah wasn't home, her car was gone. But the absence felt like a ghost, lingering in every room. I walked through the house, taking in the little details I had overlooked in the chaos. Photos of us on the walls, mementos from trips we'd taken together, the small scratches on the dining table from years of use. Each item told a story of a life I thought I understood, a life that now felt like a lie. In the bedroom, I found Sarah's wedding ring on the nightstand. She had taken it off, leaving it there like a symbol of everything that had been broken. I didn't feel anger this time, just a profound sadness. Over the next few days, I began the process of disentangling our lives. I called a lawyer, started gathering the necessary paperwork, and looked into renting an apartment in the city. It wasn't easy, but each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. One evening, Mark invited me out for that beer he'd mentioned. I almost declined but decided at the last minute to go. We met at a small, dimly lit bar downtown. Mark ordered us both around, and we sat in a corner booth, the low hum of conversation around us providing a strange sense of normalcy. "So," he began after taking a sip of his drink, "you ready to tell me what's going on?" I hesitated, but something in his expression, a mix of genuine concern and patience, made me open up. I told him everything, from the day I turned the car around to the confrontation in the bedroom. Mark listened without interrupting, his face a mask of sympathy. When I finished, he let out a long breath. "Man, that's rough," he said. "But you're handling it better than I think most people would. You're strong, Michael. Don't forget that." His words didn't fix anything, but they reminded me that I wasn't alone. As the days turned into weeks, I began to rebuild. It wasn't easy. Every step forward felt like climbing a mountain, but it was necessary. I moved into a small apartment, started focusing on my work, and reconnected with old friends. Sarah and I only communicated through our lawyers. The few times I saw her, passing by in the car or during brief meetings to finalize the divorce, she looked pale, tired, a shadow of the vibrant woman I had once loved. I didn't feel hatred anymore, only a bittersweet sense of loss for what could have been. It had been nearly 3 months since the confrontation, and my life had settled into a fragile semblance of normalcy. The apartment was small but comfortable, a space that was entirely my own. I filled the evenings with work, trips to the gym, and occasional beers with Mark. The void Sarah had left behind still ached, but it was no longer consuming. The divorce was nearing finalization, the legal proceedings dragging on longer than I'd hoped. Each interaction through lawyers felt cold, clinical, so far removed from the warmth we'd once shared. But it was necessary. I was learning to live with the quiet. It was a Saturday morning when I decided to head to the local farmers market. The air was crisp with the first hints of autumn, and the streets bustled with families, couples, and vendors peddling everything from fresh produce to handmade jewelry. I wandered through the stalls aimlessly, letting the vibrant colors and lively chatter wash over me. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of peace. And then I saw her, Sarah. She stood at a stall a few rows away, examining a bundle of sunflowers. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and she wore the same beige coat I'd bought her for our anniversary 2 years ago. My heart lurched. She wasn't alone. Beside her was Alan, the first of the many neighbors whose betrayal had shattered my world. They stood close, their body language comfortable and familiar. Alan said something that made her laugh, and the sound cut through me like a blade. I froze, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to walk away, to preserve the fragile calm I'd worked so hard to build. But another part, the part still brimming with unresolved anger and pain, urged me forward. Before I realized what I was doing, my feet carried me closer. "Michael!" Her voice was a mix of surprise and discomfort as she turned to face me. Alan's expression shifted to one of awkward guilt, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Sarah," I said, my tone flat. An uncomfortable silence settled between us. I could see her trying to gauge my mood, her eyes scanning my face for clues. How have you been?" she asked finally, her voice hesitant. "Fine," I replied, keeping my gaze steady. "And you?" She hesitated, glancing at Alan before answering. "I'm doing okay." The awkwardness was palpable. I turned my attention to Alan, whose discomfort was almost laughable. "Alan," I said with a nod. "Michael," he mumbled, unable to meet my eyes. I wanted to say more, to unload the anger I still felt toward him, but I held back. What good would it do? The damage had already been done. Enjoy the market, I said curtly, turning on my heel before either of them could respond. The encounter left me shaken. My walk through the market became a blur, the vibrant atmosphere dulled by the memories her presence had stirred. Back at my apartment, I paced the small living room, replaying the scene in my head. Seeing Sarah with Alan wasn't the gut punch I had expected. It was something worse. It was a reminder that life was moving on for her, while I still felt stuck in the wreckage of our past. Mark's voice echoed in my mind. Don't let it eat you alive. I grabbed my phone and called him. That evening, we met at a small sports bar. Mark greeted me with his usual grin and a pat on the back, but his expression shifted when he saw the tension in my face. Rough day? He asked as we slid into a booth. I nodded. Saw Sarah. With Alan. He let out a low whistle. Ouch. That's brutal, man. It's not even about them, I said, shaking my head. It's just seeing her. It brought everything back. All the lies, the betrayal. Mark nodded, taking a sip of his beer. It's going to take time, Michael. You don't just walk away from 10 years and feel fine overnight. But you're doing the right thing. You're moving forward. Am I? I asked, my voice tinged with doubt. Because right now, it doesn't feel like it. He leaned forward, his expression serious. Listen, you've been through hell. And yeah, it's gonna hurt for a while. But the fact that you're here, talking about it, trying to deal with it, that's moving forward. Don't sell yourself short. His words struck a chord. Maybe I wasn't as stuck as I felt. Maybe the simple act of trying, of not letting the pain define me, was enough for now. That night, back in my apartment, I sat by the window and looked out at the city lights. The encounter with Sarah still lingered in my mind, but it didn't feel as sharp, as overwhelming. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about the future. Not the one I'd planned with Sarah, but the one I could build for myself. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. The weeks that followed my encounter with Sarah at the market were a mix of progress and introspection. I threw myself into rebuilding my life, determined to find a sense of self outside of my marriage. My new routine became a lifeline. Early morning runs, work projects, and evenings filled with books or streaming shows I'd been meaning to watch. Mark became a regular fixture in my life, coaxing me out of my solitude with beer nights and the occasional pickup basketball game. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Still, there were moments when the silence crept in, moments when the memories of what had been and what could have been resurfaced like unwelcome ghosts. But I reminded myself that healing wasn't linear, and even the smallest steps forward mattered. It was during one of those quiet evenings, as I sat on the couch with a half-empty glass of whiskey, that my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I hesitated before answering. Hello, Michael. The voice was unmistakable, even after all this time. It was Sarah. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of emotions swirling within me. Anger, sadness, curiosity. What do you want? I asked, keeping my tone guarded. There was a pause, followed by a deep breath. I need to talk to you. It's important. Sarah, we've said everything there is to say, I replied, my voice hard. What could possibly be left? Please, Michael, she said, her voice trembling. It's not about us. It's something else. Can we meet? Just for a few minutes. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Curiosity got the better of me, and part of me wanted closure, if that was even possible. We met the next evening at a coffee shop downtown. The place was small and quiet, the hum of conversation a low backdrop as I spotted her sitting by the window. She looked different, tired, almost fragile. Michael, she said as I approached, her voice tentative. Sarah, I replied, taking a seat across from her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, charged with unspoken words. Finally, she broke it. I know I'm the last person you want to see, she began, her hands clasped tightly around her coffee cup. But I didn't know who else to turn to. I frowned. What's going on? She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room before settling on mine. I'm pregnant, she said softly. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't process what she'd said. What? I'm pregnant, she repeated, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. My mind raced. 1,000 questions flooded my thoughts. Is it mine? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head quickly. No, it's Alan's. I leaned back in my chair, trying to digest the information. Then why are you telling me this? What does this have to do with me? Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. Because I don't know what to do, she admitted. Alan, he's not ready for this. He's been distant, and I feel so alone. I didn't know who else to turn to. A bitter laugh escaped me. So, let me get this straight. You cheated on me, destroyed our marriage, and now you're coming to me for advice because your boyfriend doesn't want to step up. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But it was quickly overshadowed by the anger that had been simmering since the day I walked in on her and Alan. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know I don't deserve your help. I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for. But I didn't know who else to call. I shook my head, my emotions a tangled mess. Sarah, I don't know what you want from me. Sympathy? Forgiveness? I can't give you those things. Not after everything. She nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed someone to listen. I stood up, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. You should have thought about that before you tore our lives apart. Her sobs grew louder, drawing the attention of a few nearby patrons. I hesitated, torn between my anger and the remnants of care I still felt for her, despite everything. Sarah, I said finally, my voice softening just a fraction. You need to figure this out with Alan. It's not my responsibility anymore. I can't be that person for you. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I'm sorry, Michael, for everything. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked out of the coffee shop, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. The encounter left me rattled. Back at my apartment, I paced the living room, replaying the conversation in my head. Despite my anger, I couldn't shake the image of Sarah sitting there, vulnerable and alone. Mark's words echoed in my mind again. You're strong, Michael. Don't forget that. And for the first time, I realized he was right. I had survived the worst of it. Sarah's betrayal had broken me, but it hadn't destroyed me. Her struggles were no longer mine to bear. I poured myself a drink and sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. The future still felt uncertain, but for the first time, I felt like I had the strength to face it. The days after Sarah's revelation passed in a strange haze. Her words echoed in my mind, not because I felt responsible for her predicament, but because they reopened a door I had tried to seal shut. It wasn't just the betrayal anymore. It was the life we had once envisioned together, the dreams of a family, a future. I told myself I was done with her, and yet, the threads of the past still tugged at me in quiet moments. I decided it was time to focus on myself, not as a husband, not as a victim, but as Michael, the man who had spent too long defining himself through others. One of the first steps I took was joining a local hiking group. It wasn't something I'd ever done before, but Mark had suggested it during one of our conversations. Get out there, he said. Fresh air. New faces. It'll do you good. He was right. Our first hike was a 2-hour trek through a nearby forest preserve. The group was a mix of people, young professionals, retirees, and a few seasoned hikers who seemed to know every tree and trail by heart. One woman in particular caught my attention. Her name was Emma. She had an easy laugh and a warm, open demeanor that put everyone at ease. So, what brings you out here? She asked as we walked side by side, the trail crunching softly under our boots. Just looking for something different, I said. She smiled. Different is good. It's how you find what you've been missing. Her words stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into new experiences. I attended workshops, took up photography, a hobby I'd always been curious about, and even signed up for a cooking class. Each activity felt like a small victory, a step toward rediscovering who I was beyond the shadows of my marriage. Emma and I started spending more time together, both within and outside the hiking group. She had a way of making things feel light, uncomplicated. I found myself laughing more, something I hadn't done in what felt like ages. One evening, after a hike, we sat by a small fire pit. The group dispersed and the night quiet. "You've got a story, don't you?" she asked, her eyes studying me. "Doesn't everyone?" I replied, dodging the question. "Fair enough," she said, her smile softening. "But if you ever want to share, I'm a good listener." Despite the progress I was making, Sarah's situation lingered at the edges of my mind. I hadn't heard from her since the coffee shop, and I wasn't sure if that was a relief or a source of unease. One afternoon, I received a call from my lawyer. The divorce papers were finalized. The chapter was officially closed. I stared at the envelope when it arrived in the mail, my name and Sarah's printed neatly at the top. The finality of it was sobering. I had fought so hard to distance myself from her, from the pain she'd caused, but seeing it in black and white brought a strange sense of closure. That evening I called Mark. "It's done," I said. "How do you feel?" he asked. I thought about it for a moment. Free, but also sad. "That's normal," he said. "You loved her, man. That doesn't just disappear because things went south." He was right. My love for Sarah had been real, even if hers had faded. A week later, I ran into Sarah again, this time at a park. She was sitting alone on a bench, her hands resting on her growing belly. Part of me wanted to turn around and walk the other way, but something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the lingering sense of unfinished business. "Michael," she said, her eyes widening as I approached. "Sarah," I replied, my tone neutral. For a moment we sat in silence, the distance between us more than just physical. "How are you?" she asked, her voice tentative. "I'm okay," I said. "You?" She hesitated, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. "It's been hard, but I'm trying to figure it out." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet. "For what?" "For meeting me that day. For listening, even if you didn't owe me anything." Her words surprised me. I wasn't sure if I deserved gratitude, but I nodded anyway. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," I said, standing up. "You too," she replied, her voice soft. As I walked away, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Closure, relief, and a faint sense of hope. That evening I met Emma for dinner. As we talked and laughed, I realized that while the scars of the past would always be there, they didn't have to define me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly moving forward. The weeks with Emma passed in a way that felt both effortless and refreshing. I hadn't intended to start a new relationship so soon after everything with Sarah, but Emma's presence was like a balm to the wounds I didn't know were still healing. We kept things light at first, hiking, grabbing coffee, sharing stories about our lives. Emma had a way of making even the mundane seem interesting. She talked about her work as a graphic designer, her love for the outdoors, and the rescue cat she'd adopted a year ago, a feisty tabby named Oliver. "You should meet him sometime," she said with a grin during one of our hikes. "But fair warning, he doesn't take kindly to strangers." "Neither do I," I replied with a chuckle. Our laughter echoed through the trees, a sound that felt natural and unforced. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of her apartment, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the city lights, Emma turned to me with a question I hadn't expected. "Do you ever think about your ex?" she asked, her tone gentle but curious. I hesitated, caught off guard. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Not in the way I used to, though. It's more like a reminder of how far I've come." She nodded thoughtfully, taking a sip of her wine. "That makes sense. It's hard to let go of something that was such a big part of your life." "It is," I said, my voice quiet, "but meeting you has helped." Her smile was warm, and she reached over to place her hand over mine. "I'm glad." Despite the growing bond between Emma and me, I couldn't completely shake the shadows of my past. Sarah's situation, her pregnancy, lingered in my mind like an unresolved thread. I hadn't seen or heard from her since our encounter at the park, but a part of me wondered how she was managing. One afternoon, while I was working on a project, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number. "Michael, this is Katie. I know it's been a while, but I thought you should know. Sarah had the baby." The message hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, my thoughts racing. A second message followed. "She's doing okay, but things have been complicated. I think she could really use some support right now." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Sarah's life was no longer my responsibility, but the news stirred something inside me. Not regret exactly, but a sense of unfinished business. I texted back, "Thanks for letting me know, Katie. I'll think about it." That evening, I told Emma about the messages. "How do you feel about it?" she asked, her expression thoughtful. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Part of me wants to ignore it, but another part feels, I don't know, like I owe it to her to at least check in." Emma nodded, her gaze steady. "It's okay to feel conflicted. Just make sure whatever you decide is for you, not out of guilt or obligation." Her words stayed with me. The next day, I found myself driving toward the hospital. I hadn't planned on going, but something compelled me. Closure, maybe, or curiosity. When I arrived, I hesitated in the parking lot, staring up at the building. It had been months since I'd seen Sarah, and I wasn't sure what to expect. I asked at the front desk for her room number and made my way upstairs. When I reached the door, I paused, taking a deep breath before knocking lightly. "Come in," Sarah's voice called from inside. I pushed the door open to find her sitting in a chair by the window, holding a tiny bundle in her arms. She looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and relief. "Michael," she said softly. "Hey," I replied, stepping inside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. My eyes were drawn to the baby, small, delicate, with a shock of dark hair. "This is Lily," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's beautiful," I said honestly, my chest tightening. Sarah smiled faintly, her gaze dropping to the baby. "Thank you for coming. I didn't think you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "But I guess I wanted to see for myself that you're okay." "I'm trying," she said, her voice trembling. "It hasn't been easy, but she's worth it." The vulnerability in her words reminded me of the Sarah I'd once loved, the woman who had seemed so sure of our future. We talked for a while about Lily, about her struggles as a single mother, about the ways our lives had diverged. It was the first honest conversation we'd had in years. As I left the hospital, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't expected. Sarah's chapter in my life was finally closed, but it wasn't marked by anger or bitterness anymore. It was simply a part of my story, a part that had shaped me but no longer defined me. That evening, I met Emma for dinner. She listened as I told her about the visit, her eyes filled with understanding. "I think you needed that," she said gently. "I think I did," I agreed. As we talked and laughed, I realized how far I'd come. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer weighed me down. For the first time, I felt ready to fully embrace the life ahead of me, with all its uncertainties, challenges, and possibilities. The air carried the scent of rain, a lingering freshness that followed a morning storm. I stood on the balcony of Emma's apartment, sipping my coffee and watching the city stir to life. Cars honked in the distance, birds flitted from wire to wire, and somewhere below, a street musician played a soft, meandering tune. Life had a rhythm again. It wasn't the one I had known for most of my adult life, but it was steady, and it was mine. The days following my visit to Sarah at the hospital had been surprisingly light. Seeing her with Lily, hearing her honesty, had been the final thread I needed to cut. It wasn't closure in the sense of everything making sense, it never would, but it was enough. Enough to let go of the anger, the sadness, and the sense of failure I had carried for too long. Sarah and I exchanged a few polite messages after that, mostly about the legal logistics of the divorce and updates on Lily's health. Each message was respectful, distant. It was the relationship we were meant to have now, one of polite indifference. "Big day," Emma said, stepping onto the balcony beside me. She was wrapped in a light cardigan, her hair tied back in a loose bun. "Yeah," I said, smiling at her. Today marked a milestone. After months of therapy, reflection, and rebuilding, I was finally ready to take a leap. I was starting a new job at a nonprofit organization that focused on mentoring at-risk youth. It wasn't a path I had ever envisioned for myself, but during one of my hiking conversations with Emma, the idea had sparked, and the fire had grown from there. Think they'll like me? I asked, half joking. Emma grinned. They'll love you. You're exactly what they need. Her confidence in me was infectious. The job turned out to be everything I hoped for and more. The first day was a whirlwind of introductions, training sessions, and paperwork, but by the end of it, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. The kids I worked with were sharp, resilient, and often burdened by circumstances far beyond their control. My role wasn't just to guide them, but to show them that they had choices, that their pasts didn't have to define their futures. In many ways, it mirrored my own journey. A few weeks later, I found myself sitting in a community center gymnasium, watching a group of teenagers play basketball. One of the boys, Marcus, was particularly quick on his feet, weaving in and out of defenders with a natural ease. That kid's got talent, Mark said, sliding into the seat beside me. I laughed. What are you doing here? You think I'm going to let you do all the good work? Nah, I've got time to kill. Having Mark's support meant more than I could put into words. He'd been my rock through the worst of it, and now he was here helping me build something better. That evening, I cooked dinner for Emma at my apartment. It was a simple meal: pasta, salad, a bottle of wine, but the atmosphere was warm, intimate. I think I'm finally figuring it out, I said as we ate. Figuring what out? She asked, tilting her head. Who I am, what I want, what life can look like when it's not tied to someone else's expectations. Her smile was radiant. I'm proud of you, Michael. The simplicity of her words, the sincerity in her tone, filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Months turned into a year. Emma and I grew closer, but we took our time, respecting the spaces we both needed. Sarah's name came up less and less in my thoughts, replaced by the tangible present and the promising future. I visited Lily once more, at Sarah's invitation. The baby was growing quickly, her dark eyes curious and alert. Sarah seemed calmer, more grounded, though the traces of regret lingered in her expression. You've changed, she said as I prepared to leave. So have you, I replied. We exchanged a brief smile, an unspoken acknowledgement of the lives we were now building apart. On the anniversary of my first hike with Emma, we returned to the same trail. The forest was alive with the colors of spring, the air filled with the scent of wildflowers and earth. Feels different now, doesn't it? She said as we reached the summit. It does, I said, looking out at the sprawling view below. The journey hadn't been easy, and the scars of the past would always remain. But as I stood there, hand in hand with Emma, I realized that the scars didn't weigh me down anymore. They were a part of my story, a story that had broken, healed, and grown stronger in the process. This wasn't the life I had planned, but it was a life worth living. And that was enough. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.